A year ago today, George Floyd was still alive. Floyd's death, following the news of the killings of Ahmaud Arbery and Breonna Taylor, broke open a surge of protest for racial justice this past year. With the recent conviction of George Floyd's murderer, many of us feel a deep sense of relief that justice, in this case, has been served. And yet, over this last year, more and more names and incidents of unjust violence against Black lives has occurred again and again. Perhaps like you, I feel weary, not only from the pandemic's disruptions, but also from a deepening awareness and understanding of racial justice injustice in the U.S., past and present. Along with many of you, I've been reading books, watching films and webinars, and paying attention to the daily news with a different lens. And as you may have noticed, I've sought to preach regularly about dynamics of racial injustice and white supremacy culture throughout this year. With all of this on my mind, I made a kind of pilgrimage last week to Birmingham and Montgomery, Alabama. In Birmingham, I walked through the city park where more than 1,000 African American children skipped school to protest segregation in May of 1963. They were met with arrests, fire hoses, and dogs. Their bravery did lead to an agreement to desegregate downtown stores. Furious about the change, local segregationists responded violently by bombing the nearby motel where Dr. King and other leaders had been staying. And on September 15th, 1963, 4 little girls were killed by a bomb planted at the 16th Street Baptist Church, adjacent to the park. Years before these desegregation crusades in Birmingham, civil rights activists in Montgomery organized a months-long bus boycott. In March of 1955, an African-American teenager, Claudette Colvin, defied bus segregation laws and was forcibly removed from the bus. 9 months later, Rosa Parks was arrested for also defying bus segregation laws. In response, local Black leaders met at the Dexter Avenue Baptist Church on December 4th to create the Montgomery Improvement Association, which called for and organized the bus boycott. The charismatic Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King was elected president of the newly formed group. While King's leadership may seem obvious and expected to us today, in 1955, he was a young man who had only arrived as the pastor of Dexter Avenue Baptist the prior year, his first church. During his first 5 months as a pastor, he was still finishing up his thesis for his PhD at Boston University. Far from the monumental national figure he would become, in 1955, King was simply a young, new local pastor responding to a moment of need. So also, the thousands of people who chose to walk, carpool, and otherwise help with the boycott were people engaging in a local campaign for change, for justice. In 1955, they had no model from another city to do what they were doing. Person by person made daily choices that began a movement for historic change. In the end, the Supreme Court overturned Alabama's bus segregation laws, citing the Brown versus Board of Education decision the year before, which had desegregated schools as the legal foundation. After this success, Dr. King reflected on the role of Brown in instilling hope for change in a 1956 speech, saying, "To all men of goodwill, this decision came as a joyous daybreak to end the long night of human captivity. It came as a great beacon light of hope to millions of colored people throughout the world who had a dim vision of the promised land of freedom and justice. This decision came as a legal and sociological death blow to an evil that had occupied the throne of American life for several decades." Amidst ongoing injustices, deadly violence, and pernicious hate, King spoke of a joyous daybreak, a great beacon of light, and the promised land of freedom and justice. While there would be plenty of need for action in the years to come, King also paid attention to the places of change, of hope, of promises of freedom and justice. Today in Montgomery, the Dexter Avenue Baptist Church is now called the Dexter Avenue King Memorial Baptist Church, renamed to remember their illustrious former pastor. The parsonage where King lived is also a museum. Because of COVID closures, I could not go inside either building, but I drove by, parked, and took pictures. Why does it matter to us to be at the place where something happened or where an important person lived? For me, experiencing the physicality or materiality of a place creates a kind of bridge to the past. In a powerful essay entitled, "My Body is a Confederate Monument," African-American poet Caroline Randall Williams writes, "What is a monument but a standing memory, an artifact to make tangible the truth of the past?" To draw near to a monument, to a place, is to encounter memory in physical form. While I valued visiting the civil rights sites in Birmingham and Montgomery, I was drawn to Alabama by a desire to visit the newly built Legacy Museum and Memorial created by the Equal Justice Initiative, or EGI. As some of you may recall, EGI is the organization founded by Bryan Stevenson, author of the book Just Mercy, which has also been made into a movie. I recommend both. The museum tells a narrative of slavery and its evolution through the post-Reconstruction era of racial terror lynchings into the era of Jim Crow segregation, and finally into today's issues of mass incarceration and police violence. This narrative immerses the visitor in an unflinching look at U.S. history and the pain, indignity, and injustice experienced by generations of African Americans, as well as the extraordinary acts of resistance to this injustice. Apart from the sound of film clips playing in the exhibits, the museum held a hushed silence of sacred space. Re-emerging from the museum, I drove to the nearby National Memorial for Peace and Justice, or, as you may have heard it called, the Lynching Memorial. Massive in size, the memorial is visible as you arrive, but much remains hidden until you enter. First, you are met with sculptures of defiant and heartbroken Africans, kidnapped and chained together, imprisoned within the system of chattel slavery. I visited just after a heavy rain. Water drops still clung to the bodies like sweat, to the faces like tears. The path continues on a gentle incline beside a pristine lawn. A sign explains that this lawn is sacred space, a symbol of the many public squares where Black Americans lost their lives amid festive gatherings of white folks who joined together to witness a lynching. Arriving at the main structure, the path opens to allow you to walk among steel rectangular monuments. Inscribed upon each monument is the name of a county, as well as the names and dates of documented lynchings in that county. As you walk, the floor begins to decline as the monuments rise higher, becoming suspended overhead and an unmistakable signifier of the violence they are intended to remember. In all, there are 800 steel monuments, one for each of the counties where a lynching has been documented. Upon those 800 monuments, 4,000 names of lynching victims are inscribed. When I asked a memorial guide how they knew the inscribed names and dates, he explained the notices of upcoming lynchings were published in papers so that white folks had time to gather. Even so, many more racial terror lynchings, which is to say extrajudicial killings by beatings, shootings, or hangings, are not documented. In remembrance of those deaths, the memorial includes a massive wall, which you see on the image, with a thin veil of water falling over brass letters that reads, "Thousands of African Americans are unknown victims of racial terror lynchings, whose deaths cannot be documented, many whose names will never be known. They are honored here." Thanks, Matt. Emerging from this inner depth of sacred shadow, the path invites you again to climb upwards into a sunlit square filled with grass, bushes, and flowers. In this way, the memorial space comprises both steel and grass, hard surfaces and living ones. As a kind of bridge between these two elements of organic and inorganic matter, a final element of the museum and memorial resides in a collection of jars containing soil from lynching sites. Each jar bears a label of a name and a date. In a video about the project, Anthony Ray Hinton, himself a death row exoneree, fills a jar with soil and then expresses to it the hope that the man is at peace, adding, "I came here today, so hopefully I can get your DNA and take it to a place where you'll be respected, not leave your DNA on this roadside in Montgomery, Alabama." Whether or not the man's DNA was in that particular soil, whether or not the soil remembers the events that happened decades before in that space, when we look today at the jar of soil, the truth of the past becomes tangible. Monuments and memorials are not just celebratory or educative. As Stacey Goldman said in last week's panel discussion on race, monuments, and memory, when I think of memorials, I don't necessarily think of them as educational objects. I think of them as signaling objects. They are objects that are meant to signal specific thoughts, specific ideologies to the people who inhabit that space, who move through that space regularly. Monuments and memorials not only make the past tangible, they also interact with and shape people. Walking through the Memorial of Peace and Justice in Montgomery, the steel monuments, the jars of soil, the wall of remembrance to all the unnamed victims of lynching, immerse visitors within a truth that is painful, but critical to know if we are to move into a different future. It matters that beside the steel are the lawns, trees, and flowers. It matters that the final sculpture at the memorial depicts 3 women walking during the Montgomery bus boycotts, moving through the complicated mix of steel and lawn, injustice and hope, visitors experience both the legacies of injustice and the legacies of resistance, defiance, and protest. Both are part of the story. On my way out of Montgomery, I stopped to fill up my truck with gas before setting on the highway north. Pulling into a decades-old filling station, an older African-American man walked out to help me. Immediately, he began chatting, admiring my truck, telling me about the vintage Chevy pickup truck that he's fixing up. After I mentioned my visit to the Legacy Museum, he said his daughter works there. As I went to leave, he suggested that I turn right a block up to drive by the house where King had lived. I told him I had been there and asked, had King ever gotten gas at this station? No, he said, but he would see King walking around the neighborhood. But, he added emphatically, Rosa Parks had gotten her gas there. Reflecting on this exchange, I celebrated the fact that a man who, as a boy, had watched a young Dr. King walk the streets of his neighborhood fighting against segregation, had grown up to see his daughter employed by a Black-owned, Black-run legacy museum. Yes, change is possible, and its possibility is joyous, hopeful, and full of promises of freedom and justice. Although deepening our awareness and understanding of racial injustice can be wearying and painful, persisting matters if we are to both remember the past and work towards a better future. EGI puts it best with these words placed on a wall beneath the hanging steel monuments. We will remember with hope, because hopelessness is the enemy of justice. With courage, because peace requires bravery. With persistence, because justice is a constant struggle. With faith, because we shall overcome. So may it be.